Thomas, one of the 12 disciples of Jesus, is often remembered as the doubting apostle. But his story goes far beyond a single moment of doubt. It's the journey of a restless soul in search of truth, a man who refused to settle for easy answers, and whose heart longed for a faith that was real, not imposed. His path shows us that faith, like a seed, may take time to grow, but once it does, it blossoms with a power that can change lives. From the instant he touched the wounds of the risen Christ, Thomas was never the same. That moment didn't just erase his doubts, it lit a fire inside him that would never be extinguished. With this newfound conviction, he carried his faith beyond the borders of everything he knew, traveling to distant lands and leaving behind a legacy that still lives on today. This is the story of a man who dared to question, who stumbled through uncertainty, and who, because of it, discovered a deeper, unshakable truth. If you're drawn to biblical stories filled with emotion, struggle, and redemption, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell. Join us as we explore the life of Thomas, an apostle whose doubt became one of the most powerful testimonies of faith ever told. Thomas was born in a small, forgotten village in Galilee, an arid, mountainous land where life was simple and opportunities were few. Time seemed to pause between the rugged hills and the wild olive trees. His parents were humble folk, surviving off whatever the land would yield. Like most Galileans, they were people of tradition, faithful to the old ways. But Thomas was different from a young age. Not rebellious, just deeply curious. His gaze always seemed to pierce through words, as if he were searching for something beyond the visible. While other children quietly accepted what their elders told them, Thomas would listen and then ask questions. He wondered why the sky changed color at sunset, why the stars shimmered at night, why they had to follow rules they didn't fully understand. His mind was like a restless river, never still. And that curiosity wasn't always welcome. In a world where answers were passed down from generation to generation, asking questions could be seen as defiance. His parents watched him with a mix of pride and concern. What would become of a boy who refused to settle for what he was taught? What kind of destiny awaits someone who needs to see with their own eyes in order to believe? As the years passed, Thomas grew into a man with a quiet yet intense presence. He never physically distanced himself from his community, but in his mind, he was often somewhere far away. In the synagogue, he listened closely to the words of the rabbis, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. Yes, their teachings were wise, but without real experience they felt hollow. He didn't want a second-hand faith. He wanted to touch truth with his own hands. That's how Thomas saw the world, as a great mystery waiting to be unraveled. A constant sense of doubt pushed him to search deeper. For him, belief wasn't a duty, it was a goal. And though he didn't know it yet, that relentless search would one day lead him to one of the most life-changing encounters in all of biblical history. It was this very trait, his need to understand, his insistence on clarity before belief, that, in a strange twist of fate, brought him closer to a man unlike anyone he had ever met. A man who didn't shy away from questions, but welcomed them. A man named Jesus. Thomas first heard about Jesus of Nazareth during what seemed like a casual conversation in the bustling marketplace of his village. Amid the shouting of merchants and the clinking of trade, one rumor echoed louder than the rest. A prophet, a miracle worker, a man speaking of a new kind of kingdom, not one of war or domination but of peace, justice, and compassion. Some called him teacher. Others, simply, the carpenter's son. True to his nature, Thomas wasn't swept away by the crowd's excitement. He listened, yes, but with the same skeptical gaze he always had. Miracles? A new kingdom? Weren't those the same promises made by countless self-proclaimed prophets who faded into nothing? He didn't want stories. He wanted truth. Days passed. One afternoon, as he walked along one of Galilee's many dusty, winding roads, something caught his attention. A crowd had gathered around a man speaking with a calm, commanding presence. It wasn't the shout of a rebel or the voice of a man chasing fame. It was something else entirely. Curiosity pulled Thomas closer, weaving his way through the people. And then he saw him, Jesus, a man with a quiet strength, eyes that seemed to look straight into your soul, and a voice that didn't demand attention, it earned it. The way he spoke was different. He didn't speak with fancy words or rehearsed speeches, but with a clarity that disarmed you. He spoke of love not just as a feeling but as a daily choice, of forgiveness as an act of courage. And what shook Thomas the most? He spoke of truth as if he knew it from the inside out. Each word seemed to echo in the deepest corners of Thomas's soul, answering questions he hadn't dared to ask aloud. And yet, true to his nature, Thomas didn't surrender easily. He wasn't one to fall quickly into belief. What about the hard questions? The ones no one dared to raise? Would this man be willing to face those two? The answer didn't come right away. But something inside Thomas had begun to shift. The doubt that had so often isolated him started to become something else. A bridge, not a wall. Sometime later, when Jesus began calling his disciples one by one, Thomas found himself at an unexpected crossroads. He had been invited. The teacher looked at him, not with judgment, but with a gaze that held both understanding and challenge. Why would someone like Jesus, so wise, so confident, so full of authority, want someone like him? Someone still wrestling with questions, still unsure? The decision wasn't easy, but there was something in Jesus' eyes. A quiet promise that even doubt had a place in his path. Maybe, Thomas thought, this was the space where his questions could finally begin to make sense. Maybe this man had the patience his soul was looking for. From the moment he joined the circle of disciples, Thomas felt like he had stepped into another world. He was welcomed, yes, but he couldn't help but notice the difference. Many of the others seemed to follow Jesus with a kind of steady, almost effortless faith. Peter, for example, was bold and decisive. He didn't hesitate to believe. He didn't question the mystery. For Thomas, that was hard to grasp. His questions weren't born from rebellion, but from need. While the others walked in certainties, Thomas walked in questions. What he didn't yet know was that Jesus wasn't looking for perfect disciples. He was looking for hearts willing to seek, even if it meant stumbling through doubt along the way. John, with his calm and gentle spirit, seemed to accept everything Jesus said with a trust that, to Thomas, bordered on innocence. There was a purity in his faith, so serene, so complete, that it stirred a strange mix of admiration and confusion in Thomas. How could someone believe so easily without questioning anything? Thomas, on the other hand, couldn't help but reflect, analyze, and observe before speaking. His mind never rested, always working to understand what others seemed to accept with their hearts. The teachings of Jesus were beautiful, full of wisdom and hope. He spoke of loving one's neighbor, of forgiveness, of the kingdom of God as something near and real. But even then, Thomas couldn't stop asking himself, is all of this truly possible? Not because he didn't want to believe, but because he didn't know how to believe without first understanding. At first, he stayed quieter than the others. He listened more than he spoke. Each time Jesus performed a miracle, Thomas found himself caught between genuine wonder and a lingering doubt that refused to fade. He saw the joy and unwavering faith of the other disciples, but a shadow of uncertainty still lived in his heart. He wasn't refusing to believe, he just couldn't find a path to do it honestly. The blind faith of the others made him uneasy, not out of disdain, but because he felt they were willing to accept something he, no matter how hard he tried, still couldn't grasp. And that difference, subtle but constant, made him feel alone, even in the company of those who shared his journey most closely. But Jesus seemed to know everything. He saw beyond words, beyond silence. And he never forced Thomas to believe. He never scolded him for his skepticism, never rushed him to have a faith that wasn't ready to be born. On the contrary, he looked at Thomas with a patience that felt almost divine, as if he knew that, in time, even his doubts would become part of the testimony. And it was that patience, silent and steady, that kept Thomas close. The days with Jesus were filled with moments that defied all human logic. Thomas witnessed the first miracle at Cana, when Jesus turned water into wine. The surprise was universal. Everyone was amazed. He was there too when Jesus healed the blind, when he touched lepers and gave them not just health but dignity. Thomas saw the crowds follow Jesus, not out of fear but hope. But for Thomas, those miracles weren't final answers. On the outside, yes, he marveled, but inside, something still searched for an explanation. As if part of him still needed a personal sign, a truth that couldn't be seen with the eyes alone. Could it be possible? Thomas wondered. Could Jesus truly hold a power that went beyond all human understanding? And what if all of it was real? What if there was nothing hidden, nothing to explain with earthly logic? And then it happened. Something that shook the very foundations of his doubt, the resurrection of Lazarus. Thomas was one of the first to arrive at Martha and Mary's home. He saw it all with his own eyes, the sorrow, the mourning, the loss. Lazarus had been dead for 4 days. The grief was thick, impossible to ignore. But then, with a single command from Jesus, the dead man came walking out, still wrapped in burial cloths, breathing, alive. This was different. There was no illusion, no trick, no symbolic interpretation. Lazarus had been dead and now he lived. Thomas stood frozen, heart pounding in his chest. There was no room for logic in that moment. And yet, somehow, his soul still hadn't surrendered. Despite everything he had witnessed, he still needed something more. A certainty that didn't come through his eyes, but from the deepest part of his being. And that certainty had yet to arrive. He saw it himself, Lazarus, lifeless and still, rise at the sound of Jesus' voice. It was as if time stopped, as if even the air refused to move as everyone held their breath. A chill ran down Thomas's spine. The weight of that moment hit him harder than he cared to admit. Healing the sick was already miraculous, but bringing someone back after days in the grave, that bordered on the impossible. And yet it had happened. But even in the face of such a miracle, his mind wouldn't yield. Somewhere inside, a quiet voice kept whispering, "How can this be real?" It was as if his reason rebelled against the faith that had begun to stir in his heart. What his eyes witnessed clashed violently with the logic he had lived by, and that inner tension left him drained. Days later came the night of the Last Supper. From the moment they stepped into the room, Thomas felt something strange in the air. A heavy stillness, invisible but unmistakable, hung between them. As if destiny itself hovered above, unspoken and unavoidable. The candlelight flickered, casting dancing shadows across the walls. The usual conversations faded into long silences and uneasy glances. Jesus spoke with a calm that felt unsettling. He spoke of betrayal, of death, of farewell. Thomas sat among his brothers, quietly watching. Peter couldn't sit still, shifting in his seat. John's eyes brimmed with sorrow, rarely looking up. But what Thomas felt was something else entirely. It felt like the ground was crumbling beneath his feet, and no one else seemed to notice. His thoughts raced, his chest tightened. Jesus was speaking of leaving, of going somewhere they could not follow. Not yet. What did that mean? Unable to stay silent any longer, Thomas asked, honestly, urgently, clinging to the little he could grasp, "Lord, we don't know where you are going. So how can we know the way?" It was a simple question, but drenched in fear. He couldn't bear the idea of losing Jesus, not without understanding what was happening. Not without something, anything, to guide him through the unknown. For Thomas, nothing was more terrifying than uncertainty. Nothing more suffocating than silence in the face of an unanswered question. Jesus looked at him with that same gaze that had always brought him peace. No judgment, no laughter. Just a quiet reply that would etch itself into Thomas's soul forever. "I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me." The words lingered in the air, not just as a revelation, but as a mystery. To Thomas, it felt like being handed a key without yet knowing how to use it. He sensed the truth in those words, he felt it, but he also knew he didn't fully understand. It was like staring at a door slightly ajar into a deeper reality, but not yet having the courage to step through. Still, something began to shift inside him that night. The tension in the room grew heavier. Jesus spoke of his death, of betrayal, of how they would all scatter. Every word cut deeper than the last. Thomas felt overwhelmed, like he was standing on the edge of something vast and inevitable. A storm was coming, and he wasn't sure he'd have the strength to survive it. And yet, in the middle of that confusion, a spark of faith began to flicker. Small, fragile, but real. When Jesus was arrested, chaos erupted like a sudden downpour. Screams, confusion, fear. Nothing felt real anymore. Like the others, Thomas froze. Fear gripped every part of him. He didn't know whether to run, hide, or stand still, hoping it was all just a terrible dream. Everything Jesus had said at that final supper began unfolding before his very eyes, and that terrified him. How could he reconcile it in his mind? The one he had followed, the man who spoke with heaven's authority, who healed the sick and brought the dead back to life, was now being treated like a common criminal. The world had turned upside down, and the logic that had always anchored Thomas no longer made sense. During the crucifixion, Thomas couldn't bring himself to draw near. Like many others, he stayed at a distance, watching with a crushed heart and a mind unable to process what he was witnessing. He saw Jesus led to the cross. He saw the nails driven through his hands. He saw life slip away slowly between cries of agony and the cruel laughter of the crowd. And something inside Thomas shattered. How could the bringer of life and hope end like this, so brutal, so unjust? Deep down, Thomas refused to believe this could be the end. But the days passed, and Jesus remained dead. With each sunrise, reality tightened its grip. The Master's words faded into echoes, and the shadow of doubt grew heavier in his soul. The doubt that had always lived quietly within him now weighed like a stone. What if it had all been a mistake? What if he had followed the wrong man? In the days that followed, the disciples hid, afraid they might be next. Hope seemed to evaporate into the walls that now enclosed them. Thomas, more than anyone, pulled away. He didn't want to speak. He didn't want to listen. Sadness, fear, and above all, uncertainty consumed him. He felt he hadn't just lost his master, but the very purpose of the last years of his life. Each morning he woke up with a hollow ache in his chest. Memories haunted him. The miracles, the teachings, their walks by the Sea of Galilee, the laughter they'd shared. Now all of it seemed to vanish like smoke in the wind. The pain of doubt cut so deep, Thomas didn't know how to go on. This wasn't just about faith anymore, it was about loss. And he was completely alone with his thoughts. Then came the news. Unexpected. Impossible. Mary Magdalene's voice trembled, but it was firm. I have seen him. He's alive. Thomas barely looked up. Alive? How could anyone believe that? But then others said the same. Peter, John, more and more. They spoke of how Jesus had appeared to them, how he had spoken with tenderness, how he had shown them his hands and his side. The whole group had changed. Sorrow had given way to an overwhelming joy, pure, almost childlike. But Thomas couldn't join the celebration. Not yet. While the others laughed, prayed, and embraced with renewed hope, he withdrew in silence. Something deep within held him back from believing so easily. It wasn't distrust toward his brothers, it was loyalty to his own process. What if it was only their longing speaking? What if they were clinging to an illusion just to keep from falling apart? Thomas didn't want false hope. He didn't want to believe just because he needed comfort. He wanted the truth, he needed to see it, touch it, feel it on his skin. And so, in the midst of everyone's rejoicing, he remained skeptical, his heart torn between the yearning to believe and the need to understand. Unless I see the nail marks in his hands and put my finger where the nails were, and my hand into his side, I will not believe. Thomas's words echoed firmly through the small room where the disciples had gathered. It wasn't a statement of rebellion or contempt. It was a plea hidden in doubt. A desperate need for certainty born from grief. That was Thomas. That's how he had always been. His mind needed to see to believe, to touch in order to accept, to feel in order to surrender to faith. The testimonies of the others weren't enough. Their words were sincere, yes, but they weren't solid enough to break through the conviction that had settled in his heart since the crucifixion, that Jesus was truly gone. As days passed and the others celebrated, Thomas felt increasingly alone. He heard them speak with excitement about their encounters with the risen Lord, saw the light of hope reflected in their eyes, but he couldn't share that joy. It was as if they lived in two different worlds, one of full faith, the other of lingering uncertainty. But then, something happened. Something that would change everything. 7 days after the resurrection, as Thomas sat with the others in a locked room, the unexpected occurred. No sound, no warning, no doors opening or windows shifting. Jesus appeared among them. He was there. Not a ghost, not a vision, not the fading whisper of a memory. He was real, standing before them with the same calm, commanding presence he had always carried. And he didn't look to Peter, or John, or any of the others. His eyes went straight to Thomas. The air thickened. The silence was so intense that Thomas could hear the pounding of his own heart. His body tensed, his thoughts raced in chaos. Is this real? Is it truly him? Am I dreaming? But before he could utter a single word, it was Jesus who broke the silence. Thomas, put your finger here, he said, extending his hand, the same hand that had been pierced by nails. There was no reproach in his voice, no trace of judgment or anger. It was soft, warm, the voice of someone who fully understood the deepest wound of another soul. Then he added, reach out your hand and place it in my side. Stop doubting and believe. Thomas's world shattered and was rebuilt in a single heartbeat. With trembling hands he stepped forward. He touched the scars. He placed his hand on the wounded side of his master. The marks were there. Not stories. Not symbols. They were real. But what moved him most was not just the evidence he had demanded. It was knowing that Jesus understood him. That he had listened. That he had come for him. In that moment, Thomas didn't feel proud for being right, nor relieved by the proof. He felt shame for having doubted, and overwhelming gratitude for being met with grace. Tears welled in his eyes. His heart overflowed. He dropped to his knees and cried out, "My Lord and my God." All doubt vanished. Only faith remained. A faith born not of stories but of encounter, of love, of the infinite patience of Jesus. Everything Thomas thought he knew collapsed in that moment. Jesus, the one he feared he had lost forever, stood before him alive. Still bearing the marks of sacrifice, yet radiating a peace that transcended all understanding. Astonishment wrapped around him, and he couldn't hold back the words that spilled from his soul, "My Lord and my God." It was a whisper, but it carried the weight of his entire being. In that instant, his whole life, his struggle with doubt, his sorrow and fear of loss, dissolved. It was as if the burden he had carried for years lifted off his shoulders, and he could finally breathe again. The faith he had longed for so desperately, the certainty he had yearned to grasp, stood right before him, embracing him in the form of his master. The doubt that had been his constant companion faded away, and in its place was born a faith so profound, he didn't know he was capable of feeling it. Touching the wounds of Jesus was not merely an act of verification, it was an act of complete surrender. In that sacred touch, Thomas grasped something deeper than any teaching or miracle could convey. Faith isn't just about understanding the impossible, it's about embracing what the heart already knows. Now he no longer saw only with his eyes, he felt with his heart a truth he had never imagined embracing so fully. But this renewed faith didn't turn him into a blind follower, accepting without question. Thomas never stopped being who he was, a man of questions, of deep reflection. The difference now was that his doubts no longer held him back. Instead, they drove him. They became fuel, urging him to seek more answers, to understand the purpose of his mission more deeply, and to share the truth with a passion that burned inside him. He no longer accepted the words of others simply because they were spoken. He had touched the truth with his own hands, and that truth now lived within him. The transformation in Thomas was so profound that those who knew him before could see it clearly. He was no longer the man who stood at a distance. No longer the skeptic who doubted everything, who questioned even the holiest of things. Now Thomas spoke with a fire in his voice. There was something in his eyes, a light, a certainty, forged deep within after touching the very essence of truth. From that moment on, Thomas no longer shared mere stories of what he had seen. He spoke with the conviction of someone who had stood at the edge of the abyss, and returned, unable to stay silent about the light he had found. His words carried a new weight, a force that didn't just inspire, it challenged. He was ready to carry the message of Jesus farther than others dared to go, crossing borders, facing dangers many would avoid out of fear or doubt. After Jesus' ascension, the disciples scattered, each taking the seed of the gospel to distant corners of the earth. But Thomas, his path took him even further, eastward, into unknown lands, foreign cultures, places few would venture. There, in the midst of unfamiliar tongues and distant soil, Thomas became an unrelenting preacher of Christ's resurrection. He faced persecution. He endured trials and sacrifices, but he never wavered. His faith wasn't just an echo of Jesus' words, it was the living testimony of a man transformed. A testimony he carried with him wherever he went. Thomas's journey wasn't easy, but every step was marked by an unshakable conviction, a fire lit by grace and fanned by truth. Through his travels, Thomas not only carried the message of Christ, but in doing so, he transformed his own life. And during those journeys, far from his homeland, Thomas found the peace he had long sought. A peace that came not only from the certainty of his faith, but from the commitment to that faith, the commitment to share it with the entire world. It is said that Thomas's travels took him to faraway places, where the culture, traditions, and gods were completely different from those he had known in his homeland. It was in the land of India, a place so distant and foreign, that Thomas embarked on his mission. There, with a conviction that only someone who had personally touched the truth could have, he began preaching about the risen Christ, sharing his experience with those who had never heard of him. At first, the journey was difficult. The locals watched him with suspicion. Many saw him as a foreigner bringing strange and revolutionary ideas. The concepts of one God and a man crucified to save humanity clashed with the deeply rooted beliefs in that land. But Thomas, transformed by his own faith and the experience of having touched Jesus' wounds, was not discouraged. Every word that came from his mouth carried the weight of a man who had witnessed the impossible. He was a man who had touched both death and life, and now shared that testimony with the world. He began healing the sick, comforting the afflicted, and preaching about the love of a God who, for the sake of humanity, had sacrificed himself on the cross. Little by little, he gained the trust of those he approached. People began to listen, drawn to the teachings of this man whose life seemed to reflect the peace and hope he preached. And so, gradually his message began to bear fruit. But as his influence grew, so did the challenges. Local leaders, both religious and political, did not take kindly to Thomas's message. They feared the change it could bring. The message of one God, offering salvation to all without distinction, began to undermine the power structure that had prevailed in the region for generations. The idea of a universal faith, of God's unconditional love for all, started to threaten the very foundations of local traditions and established hierarchies. However, Thomas did not waver. He knew what he had experienced, he knew the truth he had touched, and he was willing to move forward no matter what stood in his way. He was no longer the man filled with doubts that he had once been. Now, his faith was firm and his determination unshakable. With courage, he continued preaching the gospel, convinced that the truth he shared was not only transformative but also necessary for the world. The initial attempts by local leaders to discredit him were subtle. Suspicious glances, conversations that abruptly stopped when he entered a room, and murmurs behind his back. However, as his message gained more ground, the threats became more direct. The priests of the temple and the rulers of the city began conspiring openly against him. The powerful could no longer allow his teaching to spread without taking action. Thomas, however, with the calmness of someone who had embraced both the cross and the resurrection in his life, did not back down. He knew hard times were coming, but his mission was clear: to share the truth of the risen Christ. He faced all kinds of adversity with the courage of someone who, after experiencing the deepest doubts, had found in his heart a certainty that nothing could destroy. The obstacles presented to him only strengthened his faith. With each new threat, with every new challenge, Thomas rose with more strength, more conviction, and more love for the message he had been called to spread. And so, in distant lands, Thomas continued preaching the gospel, challenging established beliefs and facing opposition with unwavering determination. He knew his life was in danger, but he also knew that something far greater was at stake: the truth of Christ that had transformed his life, and the hope that truth could bring to a needy world. The people he had converted began to be persecuted, and Thomas knew it wouldn't be long before he was next. Despite the growing danger, he did not stop. He kept preaching, helping the sick, and teaching about Jesus to anyone willing to listen. He knew his mission was greater than any fear he might feel. One night, after a long day of preaching, Thomas received an unexpected visit. A group of men, led by an influential priest, confronted him. The priest warned him, making it clear that his preaching would be his downfall if he continued. But Thomas, with a calmness that only someone fully devoted to faith could possess, responded that he did not preach by his own choice, but by a higher calling. "If I do not do it," he said, "who will?" The tension surrounding Thomas finally reached its peak. He knew his time was running out, but he never doubted. Conversions continued, and this only enraged the powerful further. It was on a hot morning, while preaching in a small village, that the men finally came to find him. When Thomas saw them approaching, he did not flee. He faced them with the serenity of someone who had already prepared for this moment. The faces of the villagers he had converted were filled with fear, but he reassured them with a simple glance. He knew his sacrifice was inevitable. The men dragged him to a hill on the outskirts of the city. There, the trial was swift and brutal. Accused of blasphemy and of subverting the religious order, Thomas was condemned to death. He was pierced with spears repeatedly, but even as pain consumed him, Thomas remained calm, knowing that the mission entrusted to him had been fulfilled. As he fell to the ground, as his life slipped away, he felt no fear, only a profound peace. It is said that Thomas's journey took him to faraway lands, where the culture, traditions, and gods were completely different from those he had known in his homeland. It was in the lands of India, a place so distant and strange, where Thomas began his mission. There, with a conviction that only someone who had touched the truth personally could have, he began to preach about the risen Christ, sharing his experience with those who had never heard of him. At first, the path was hard. The local people watched him with suspicion. Many saw him as a foreigner bringing strange and revolutionary ideas. The concepts of one God and a man crucified to save humanity clashed with the deeply rooted beliefs in those lands. But Thomas, transformed by his own faith and by the experience of having touched the wounds of Jesus, was not discouraged. Every word that came from his mouth carried the weight of a man who had been a witness to the impossible. He was a man who had touched death and life, and now he shared that testimony with the world. He began healing the sick, comforting the afflicted, and preaching the love of a God who had sacrificed himself on the cross for humanity. Slowly but surely, he gained the trust of those he approached. People started to listen, feeling drawn to the teachings of this man whose life seemed to reflect the peace and hope he preached. And so, little by little, his message began to bear fruit. But as his influence grew, so did the challenges. The local leaders, both religious and political, did not look favorably upon Thomas's message. They feared the change it could bring. The message of one God, offering salvation to all without distinction, began to undermine the power structure that had prevailed in the region for generations. The idea of a universal faith, of God's unconditional love for all, began to threaten the very foundations of local traditions and established hierarchies. Thomas, however, did not waver. He knew what he had experienced, he knew the truth he had touched, and he was willing to press forward, no matter what stood in his way. He was no longer the man full of doubts he had once been. Now, his faith was steadfast, and his determination unshakable. With courage, he continued preaching the gospel, convinced that the truth he shared was not only transformative but also necessary for the world. The first attempts by the local leaders to discredit him were subtle. Suspicious glances, conversations that abruptly stopped when he entered a room, and murmurs behind his back. However, as his message gained more ground, the threats became more direct. The temple priests and city rulers began to openly conspire against him. The powerful could no longer allow his teaching to spread without taking action. Thomas, however, with the serenity of someone who had embraced the cross and resurrection in his life, did not retreat. He knew difficult times were coming, but his mission was clear: to share the truth of the risen Christ. He faced all kinds of adversities with the courage of someone who, after having lived through the deepest doubts, had found in his heart a certainty that nothing could destroy. The obstacles that presented themselves only strengthened his faith. With every new threat, with every new challenge, Thomas rose with more strength, more conviction, and more love for the message he had been called to spread. And so, in distant lands, Thomas continued preaching the gospel, challenging established beliefs and facing opposition with unwavering determination. He knew his life was in danger, but he also knew there was something much greater at stake: the truth of Christ that had transformed his life, and the hope that this truth could bring to a world in need. In the end, the story of Thomas is a testament that faith does not need to be perfect from the start. What matters is the sincerity with which we seek, for it is on this journey where we find the answers. If you enjoyed the story of Thomas and want to keep seeing other stories of faith and perseverance, don't forget to like this video and share it with your loved ones. And of course, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any new content. Together, let's explore more powerful lessons from the Bible.